Under the Red Hood is a tell-all autobiography of Hollis Mason Todd, who was beaten to death by the comedian with a crowbar, or was it a trophy, and who was brought back to life by Rachel Manhattan, who hired the comedian as a distraction because Ozymandias told him to, but he didn't mean for him to die. Okay, it's official. I've watched so many of these things, I can't keep them straight anymore. Spoiler warning, the following is an in-depth analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. Batman Under the Red Hood involves 4 different villains, a long-dead character brought back to life, and it's only 75 minutes long. Considering DC's direct-to-video track record of adapting stories too long to really fit into that format without heavily paring them down, like we saw with Superman Doomsday, among others, and add in the fact that it's based on a story that wasn't especially popular with the fans because it brought back one of the major characters most readers had no interest in seeing back to life, this should have been a recipe for absolute disaster. But this is one of those rare instances where a movie actually sold me on a premise I totally hated before watching it. So often I love an idea, but the execution doesn't live up to it. But I can't think of too many times where I was pretty against a concept and then was completely won over by it in the end. What makes it such a strong effort is that the return of Jason Todd is a thoughtful study of Batman and the world he lives in, rather than just a pointless gimmick to bring back a character famous for dying. It goes out of its way to prove it's much more than that. Batman Under the Red Hood is an entertaining and thought-provoking film that does nearly everything right, effortlessly juggling a lot of characters in a well-thought-out story, which manages to avoid a lot of the mistakes of its other DC direct-to-video predecessors. One thing these movies often struggle with is working as standalone outings without much prior knowledge of the universe or characters, because they're usually based on stories with a lot of continuity surrounding them. That's one of the reasons I thought Justice League New Frontier was a good pick, because it's set in an alternate world outside the main DC universe, and it's a complete standalone movie. Now, All-Star Superman was set up the same way, and the only thing that really gave it trouble was its length, trying to condense 12 issues into 75 minutes. Under the Red Hood doesn't immediately seem like a good graphic novel to adapt at all, because not only is it set in mainstream Batman continuity, not only did it drastically affect pre-established status quo, but it was also deeply rooted in events that occurred in the continuity over a decade earlier. But Judd Winnick manages to weave the two stories together in such a way that neither is required reading for any layperson to understand and enjoy this film. I might have expected the events from Death in the Family to just be there at the beginning as a teaser flashback to catch us up in case we didn't know how Jason died, and that the only relevant information from that would be that he died. But the whole narrative revolves around that scene. Batman digs up Jason's grave later on after he realizes he's still alive, and the dummy inside leads him to Ra's al Ghul, who explains how he hired the Joker to distract Batman, not intending him to kill Jason. When Jason gets his hands on the Joker at the end, he takes him back to Crime Alley where he died, and he recreates the same situation with the roles reversed, enacting his revenge on the Joker by trying to beat him to death with a crowbar just as the Joker did. In effect, the movie serves as an effective adaptation of both Under the Red Hood and Death in the Family. This story was also an excellent choice because the dark subject matter and violent themes, especially with a teenager being beaten to death with a crowbar, makes the PG-13 rating necessary and not forced, like some of these DC animated movies have been. I've talked about this in other reviews, but the whole point of this video series seems to be making animated DC comic movies for adults. Rather than being rated after the fact, they intentionally go for a PG-13 so grown-ups will buy them expecting edgier, more adult content. This was, at the time, the absolute best this was handled, with a story that couldn't possibly be told as effectively without the violence in the language, and yet it doesn't go overboard in either department. Although I do think now Superman vs. the Elite was also effective at that. I'm impressed with the movie's pacing. It gets a lot of storytelling done in a short amount of time. It never feels rushed. It takes moments after intense scenes to breathe with something a little lighter, and it doesn't pad with unnecessary action and then skimp out on themes and characterization. Even with so many characters, everyone gets plenty to do and fits squarely into the film thematically. dramatically. There's some pretty heavy ideas being dealt with about Batman and Jason Todd's morality, about whether Batman is to blame for his death because of his refusal to put the Joker out of his misery, and Jason's plan to control all the crime in Gotham rather than try to stop it, to curb the worst of it, and actually make the city a better place overall, rather than putting out small fires just so larger ones can erupt later. But as short as the film is, and even with these big ideas, the movie takes the time to have a sense of humor and let its characters come to life. We've got a movie with the Joker in it, and he's funny, but the real comic relief here is Black Mask, who made me laugh out loud when he says, referring to the Red Hood, "When he gets here, I want a party waiting for him. And when I say party, I really mean a whole lot of guys who are gonna kill him." And I think the best move, and the one that really sets this one apart from the others in the direct-to-video line, is using the guy who wrote the original graphic novel, Judd Winnick, to write this movie, because he took the opportunity to improve on the original. In the comics, Jason Todd is brought back to life through a pretty eye-rolling contrivance, brought back by what is often referred to as the Superboy Prime Punch, a MacGuffin designed to change anything in DC continuity you can't change by doing things that make sense. But because this movie wants to stand on its own and make sense without the rest of convoluted post-crisis DC stuff, when it changed it to what I always thought would make the most sense for bringing someone back in a Batman story, and that's to use the Lazarus Pit. And Winnick is so thoughtful about it this time around that he actually uses the Lazarus Pit not to simply bring the character back, but also to make us question Jason's sanity, since the pit seems to leave people a little crazier when they come out than when they went in. And he never tells us definitely if Jason's actually partially motivated by a degree of insanity, or if he'd just be like this if it wasn't the Lazarus Pit. We're invited to decide that for ourselves. I have a lot of respect for a writer who takes the chance to make something he did better. I've talked to a lot of fans who say they prefer to consider this version canon over the comics. You rarely hear that about any film adaptation of anything. The Red Hood is a great occasion for story because he introduces a new element into an established status quo that shakes things up for the city on the whole and then makes things personal for Batman, who the movie is really about. Batman's the only character who really goes through an arc, and although he thinks he's the real good guy, Jason Todd is clearly the film's main antagonist by the end. A lot of the best bad guys don't think they're the bad guy and can't understand why their protagonist isn't on their side. So the resurrected Jason Todd, who Batman sees as his greatest failure, the sidekick who Batman couldn't save both mentally and physically, becomes the perfect opponent for him, the anti-Batman. Usually characters are brought back from the dead just so that companies can capitalize on them some more, but Winnick really makes a good case here for Jason Todd's story only really being half told at the time of his death. It isn't until Batman is faced with him after his resurrection that he has to really deal with their difference in philosophies. He tells Alfred that Jason was his greatest failure, and it's clear that it's been weighing on him ever since. But now that Jason's back, physically haunting him, he has to come to grips with the fact that not only could he not save Jason from the Joker, but that if he didn't put his own morality over other people's lives, if he allowed himself to do horrible things so more people could live, Jason would still be alive. He blames Batman for his death, not because he didn't get there in time, but because Batman won't kill the Joker, who killed Jason. And while the story is really about Bruce and Jason, the other major characters involved are deeply woven into this debate about how crime should be handled, each representing a different philosophy. Here's my criminal to crime fighter scale for this movie. The Joker, as he calls himself in The Dark Knight, here too is an agent of chaos. He's not interested in controlling organized crime so much as he is in making it disorganized. He's hired by both Ra's al Ghul and Black Mask at various points in the film, and each time he starts out seeming to do what he's paid for and ends up putting a wrench in their plans, simply because they have plans. So he kills Jason Todd, not because it fits into some grand scheme, but simply because nobody expected him to do that. And I think he just wanted to see Batman's reaction. Same thing with Black Mask. The first mob boss to run all of Gotham crime in 20 years, Joker doesn't want to live in a world that organized, so when Black Mask gets him out of prison, he tries to kill Black Mask and all of his cronies. Now next to the Joker, you have Black Mask, a master criminal who simply wants to run all the crime. He's all about control and just wants to make sure he's top dog in Gotham at all times, and is perfectly willing to kill whoever he needs to and sell drugs to anyone who will buy to solidify his hold. Square in the middle is the Red Hood, the big gray area, and incidentally, the most interesting. He calls himself the better Batman, because as he sees it, Bruce is too idealistic. Jason says, you can't stop crime, and the best you can hope to do is to control it. So he uses the skills he learned from Bruce to become a different kind of mob boss, trying to take down Black Mask. He doesn't try to force anyone to stop selling drugs, but those he controls aren't allowed to sell to children. He takes a cut of drug money, promises protection for those under his watch, and takes a 40% cut of the drug money. He doesn't see himself as a criminal, but sees getting his hands dirty as a necessary evil if he wants to cause big sweeping changes to such a corrupt city. So the only way to stop the worst of crime is to become the biggest mob boss and run all the crime yourself. Next to the Red Hood, we have Ra's al Ghul. His philosophies aren't fleshed out in this movie, and admittedly, we have to make some assumptions based on the comic book version. So since I believe a movie should stand on its own, perhaps he shouldn't even be on this list. But we do know that when he hired the Joker, he was trying to topple a corrupt government, so we can make some guesses as to where he fits here. Ra's doesn't want to control crime, he just wants to completely stamp it out, willing to kill like Red Hood, but unwilling to be party to the kinds of crime he wants to stop. Like Batman, he believes it's possible to stop crime, but unlike Batman, he sees himself completely above the law and believes himself qualified to decide who should live and who should die. Then, of course, there's Batman, who believes in the law but doesn't rely on it solely because he's seen firsthand that it isn't enough. He thinks the law is too limited, and so he does resort to vigilante activities to get results, but he draws the line at killing anyone, believing, as he says to Jason toward the end of the movie, that if he allows himself to kill, he'll become the very people he's fighting against. Jason says it's too hard for Batman to kill, but Batman corrects him, saying it would be all too easy, and that's why he can't do it. As much as he'd love to kill the Joker, once he allows himself that liberty, he doesn't think he could ever go back. So he does what he can, limited only by his own sense of humanity. Even if it means innocent people will suffer at the hands of murderers he could have killed himself, Batman won't allow himself to become what he sees as a monster, or he would just be part of the same problem. And finally, next to Batman, at the furthest end from the Joker, is Nightwing, who's key to this whole dynamic because he's the protege that actually turned out the way Batman wanted. Both Dick and Jason were taught the same way by Batman, but because their backgrounds and experiences were so different, Dick bought what Batman was selling and Jason saw things differently. Even before his death, Jason thought they should use more brutality against criminals. I put Dick on the other side of Batman because he's even closer to the law than Batman is, I think. He won't kill either, but given Dick's lighthearted temperament, the gracefulness he has instead of Bruce's gruffness and his tendency to joke, I imagine Bruce still gets closer to that line than Dick does. There are probably tactics Batman would use when interrogating or fighting someone in an extreme situation that Dick wouldn't even consider. He still doesn't work entirely within the letter of the law, of course, but I doubt if he's as rough on criminals as Batman is. When Batman interrogates the thugs after he and Nightwing take out Amazo, he drops Amazo's body down over them just before it drops on them. Nightwing doesn't flinch. He's used to seeing Batman do things like this, and still, I doubt if he would have handled it the same way. Again, I'm really extrapolating maybe too much from what I know about these characters in the comics versus strictly what we're given about them here, and perhaps just based on this movie, Batman and Nightwing should be right on top of each other on this scale. Either way, Nightwing is clearly very different from Jason, more or less being in agreement with Batman's philosophy. I think it's really interesting to note how Bruce, Dick, and Jason's origins play into their ideas about crime. Of course, Batman won't kill because he saw his parents murdered in front of him, and he doesn't want what happened to him to happen to other people. The same thing happened to Dick, but he's more laid back and less brooding than Bruce because he had Bruce, the support of the father figure who understood what he went through. How Batman met Jason is also really telling. He was taking the tires off the Batmobile. This was a street kid with no ideals and no direction, who Batman took in and trained to give him something meaningful to do with his life. Bruce had the best of intentions, but the difference between Jason and both Dick and Bruce is that they had memories of a loving, supporting family. That security and support is what they lost, and that's what fuels their fight. But not Jason. He didn't have the kind of family Dick and Bruce had. We're not told exactly what his home life was like, but we can easily gather that from simply how Bruce finds him. And so he seems to fight because that's all he knows. Bruce couldn't relate to Jason on the same level he did with Dick, so he simply tried the exact same thing, and in the end, he was never able to get through to Jason. Importantly, Jason didn't have a big origin that made him put on the costume like Bruce and Dick. He was just brought in off the street and into the fold. His defining moment, his tragic origin, was his own death. Like the death of Bruce and Dick's parents, his own death set the foundation for the man he would be when Ra's brought him back to life. He wasn't gunned down by some desperate thief, he was brutally battered by a psychotic madman who Bruce could have killed years before, but never did. So when he takes up his new mantle, Jason vows not to stop criminals like the ones that killed Bruce's parents, but to be the better Batman. Not to do what is right, but whatever he feels is necessary. Because Batman didn't do that. and that's why he died. Even though Jason tells Batman he forgives him for not saving him, he can't forgive him for letting the Joker live. He feels Batman put his own morality above Jason's life, and so he gives Batman an ultimatum. The only way he can make it right in Jason's eyes is to become like Jason, to be willing to control the crime. He throws Batman a gun, which is, by the way, a really haunting image, I think. Seeing Batman, who famously hates guns, looking down at it in the palm of his hand, almost like it's the same one that killed his own parents. And Jason tells Bruce that if he wants to stop him from killing the Joker, he's going to have to shoot Jason. Batman finds a way out of the scenario, of course, throwing a batarang into Jason's gun, but what's really interesting is that Jason doesn't try to shoot the Joker when Batman refuses to play along. He tries to shoot Batman. So the question is, why? The movie does an excellent job of giving the viewer a lot of credit and letting us decide this for ourselves. There's no big platitude at the end spelled out by Batman in dialogue, it just happens, and we get to make up our own minds about why. Is it because the Lazarus Pit really did make Jason insane and now he's totally snapped? Is it because he blames Batman for his death and now he's lashing out because he won't admit he's wrong? Or is it because Jason thinks Batman's really the dangerous one, that he's worse than the Joker because he'd rather save the Joker than make sure he can't kill anyone else? Ultimately, I think this story validates Batman's ideals by having Jason try to shoot him. Batman says killing is the easy thing to do, and Jason's proven that. He's killed a lot now, and as soon as things don't go his way, he aims his gun at his old mentor and friend instead of the psychopath who was really responsible for his death. Jason wanted to control crime, but he's lost it. He's almost as whacked out as the Joker. There's a certain logic to his plan, and he's absolutely a sympathetic villain. I can definitely see why a part of him would resent Bruce for his death. But when the time comes for him to really show Batman who he really is, he proves that crossing that line really has made him no different from the criminals Batman refuses to kill. Aesthetically, I really like the idea of Jason Todd taking up the Red Hood mantle. That's really telling of his character. He takes the name of the man who killed him before he went insane and then tries to do what he thinks Batman always should have done. He tries to be something between Batman and the Joker. That costume is almost a visual admission that what he's doing is insane, thinking he's somehow still a good guy by becoming a criminal to stop the worst of crime. He's a perversion of everything Batman stands for and rubs that in by taking the name of another villain Batman created through an unfortunate mistake. Jason is nothing if not poetic. And speaking of Joker when he was the Red Hood, I love the use of flashbacks in this movie. They're almost always from the perspective of someone, usually Batman, in the present, remembering something that happened in the very location he is at the time. That event then happens again before his eyes, and it's always an important event that's integral to the narrative. The last one, which closes the movie, is really sad after everything that's happened, as Alfred remembers the first time Jason suits up as Robin, all excited to go out on patrol, and he says to the man who he'll later blame for his death, "This is the best day of my life." I gotta be honest, and you can laugh at me if you want to, but that choked me up a little bit. I'll briefly mention a few production things. The voice cast is all really good, probably my favorite of the original cast in one of these, rather than using any of the Batman animated series cast. Bruce Greenwood, who played Pike in the 2009 Star Trek movie, does a somewhat similar Batman to Kevin Conroy, but it's a little deeper and more subdued. Definitely more brooding, which works great for this material. Jensen Ackles is the perfect Red Hood Jason Todd. He sounds young but weathered, and there's an unsettling edge to his voice. And Neil Patrick Harris, who I always love, does Nightwing, and he keeps it pretty reserved. I don't think you'd even notice it was him unless you were looking for it, which is great because it doesn't distract from his performance. There are a few things that don't work for me about this movie. One is the CG chase scene toward the beginning. In the commentary, Bruce Timm mentions that it's cheaper to do those scenes in computer animation, and they have to cut some corners because they don't have great budgets for these movies. So it's a necessary evil, but I do find the difference in animation jarring. It goes from something pretty detailed to this CG that looks almost not fully rendered to me. Luckily, it's really only in that one place. And this is a really minor gripe, but I was a little distracted by the fight in the bathroom, where Red Hood was breaking through porcelain and he throws Batman through a wall. It's much too reminiscent of a scene from The Matrix. It's strange that both Ra's and Red Hood think hiring the Joker is a good idea. While it's necessary to get Jason into a Lazarus Pit, and I still really like that method of bringing him back, it's a little contrived. It just doesn't seem like something Ra's would be stupid enough to do. And how can Jason be absolutely sure that the way he's pushing Black Mask will lead him to a plan to break the Joker out of prison? This is one of those plots where by the time you get to the part where the villain says something like, "I was 5 steps ahead and I planned it the whole time. I set the whole thing up so you do that," I start tracing his steps and I just can't see how he could be sure that it would work. And in this case, why hiring the Joker was the obvious step to take? Though I do really like, again, Jason's sense of poetic irony, coming up with a way to get Black Mask to hire the Joker, the man who was hired by Ra's when he got killed. And I've heard some viewers complain that Amazo is out of place in a street-level Batman movie all about organized crime. I felt that way too the first time watching it. It is a little jarring to see a giant cyborg with superpowers in the middle of this gritty world that easily could be a place without superpowers. But I wonder if it doesn't help cement this as a universe where these sorts of things are possible. Perhaps the Lazarus Pit would seem out of place if it was the only supernatural thing in the whole movie. Of course, that doesn't really explain the weird cyber assassins with light swords. Despite all that, I'm going to give Batman Under the Red Hood a 4 out of 4. All the elements really come together to tell a tight story that really questions Batman's convictions, and also proves that just because an overused trope, like bringing comic book characters back from the dead, is generally a bad idea, every now and again, a bold exception comes along.